Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to have you here today for our webinar, Transport Infrastructure, is Government Investment Going to Equip Us for the Future? This webinar is proudly brought to you by Grattan Institute and ARB Group. My name is Rosemary Patterson and I'll co-moderate this session and provide tech support if required. My esteemed colleague Andrew Meyer, who is Manager National Interest Services, joins me from ARB Group as our primary moderator today. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Rosemary, and hello and welcome to all the attendees today. I'll just start by explaining that the National Interest Services Program, or NIS, is supported by the Federal, State and Territory Government Road and Transport Agencies to coordinate land transport information access nationally and with links internationally, and is managed by ARB Group. Facilitating the webinar is one of a range of services under NIS. The content itself of the webinar has been produced by the Grattan Institute and the opinions expressed are those of the Grattan Institute. After the webinar you can find more about the freely accessible NIS resources via the ARB website. I'd also like to introduce my NIS program colleague Catherine Rawlinson, who will be receiving and asking audience questions that are logged by attendees during the presentation. These will be asked at an appropriate pause within the presentation itself, so please be patient if you've logged a question. It will be asked when Marion pauses her presentation. So welcome everyone, and I will hand back to Rosemary for a few more housekeeping items and also to introduce Marion herself.
And welcome to Catherine.
Thank you.
We plan to run the webinar for approximately 30 minutes, allowing for time for questions. We'd like to make our audience aware that, as always, we are recording today's session and will be sure to share the footage with you on conclusion of the webinar. Webinars work best when they are interactive, so please type your questions into the chat box and we'll address them as we can. If your question doesn't get answered, we'll see what we can do via email later. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Marion Terrell from Grattan Institute, who is leading policy analyst and former public servant and who has worked in the private sector. Marion's public policy experience ranges from authoring parts of the 2010 Henley Tax Review to leading the design and development of the MyGov account. She has provided expert analysis and advice on labour market policy for the Commonwealth Government, the Business Council of Australia and at the Australian National University. Marion joined the Grattan Institute in April 2015. And let's hear from you, Marion, now. Great to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Rosemary, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So it's great to be here, and I'm hoping that we can treat this webinar as best we can as if we're in the one room together. So today I'm talking about transport infrastructure and particularly about government investment and how well it equips us for the future. The way I thought I would approach this today is to talk about a research report that I've just published last week and to tell you a bit about my findings and also to take your questions and comments on that. So the subject of my report is cost overruns on transport infrastructure, and I've had several reasons I wanted to explore this area. Firstly, it's building on an earlier report I wrote about government infrastructure investment. This one is different because it drills down to individual projects. And the other reason was I'd read the work of a Danish economic geographer that some of you may be familiar with, Bengt Flyberg, who has published a lot on mega projects and cost overruns. And I was curious to see whether his international research was also true in Australia. So I'll start by talking to you about a bit of an overview of the key findings, and they are, I looked at the past 15 years of government transport infrastructure investment. I looked at all the projects valued at $20 million or more, and what I found in a nutshell is that Australian governments have spent $28 billion more on transport infrastructure than they told taxpayers that they would. That's around 24% of the project's total value. So I'll tell you a little bit about these findings. To start off with, people do tend to think cost overruns are rare, but unfortunately they're not rare enough. This slide shows you that while the majority of projects come in reasonably close to their announced cost, when they go wrong, it can be quite spectacular. So the top panel is showing you how often cost overruns occur, and the bottom panel is showing you the magnitude of those cost overruns. And what this shows is that 90% of the cost overrun problem can be explained by 17% of projects that went over their announced cost by more than 50%. The single biggest cause of cost overruns is premature announcements. The way I looked at this was to look at the project life cycle in terms of the early phase when a politician, a minister or an opposition announces a new highway or metro line or whatever it might be for a particular cost but doesn't make a funding commitment. From that first announcement up to the first formal funding commitment is the early period. From the first formal funding commitment through to the beginning of construction is the middle period, and then during construction is the third period. And what you can see in this slide is that only about a third of projects are actually announced before there's a formal funding commitment, but these account for about 3/4 of the total value of overruns. Not only that, but so with these premature announcements, that you might think, well, no money's been committed, it doesn't really matter. But the early announced projects are different in character to those that are announced with more mature cost estimates. And this slide shows you how that is. So the top line is these premature announcements, and the middle line is those announced when there is also a formal funding commitment, and the bottom line announced later on at the beginning of construction. And what you can see here is that the costs of premature announcements are not just a warning to take politicians' promises with a grain of salt. In fact, these cost overruns haunt projects throughout their lives. The cost of prematurely announced projects are typically revised upwards by 25% when they get a formal funding commitment, and by a further 26% between the formal budget commitment and the end of construction. So I'll take a step back now and tell you a bit more about the study and how we did it. There are two aspects of this study that were unique and shed light on the issue of project costs in a new way. The one feature of the report is shown in the slide that you can see now, which is that we examined cost overruns from the first announced cost. So it is much more common for studies of cost overruns to look from the final business case or the first funding commitment or some other point. And that's absolutely appropriate if what you're interested in is project management or procurement or those kind of questions. But if you are interested in public finance, it is much more illuminating to look from this first announced cost. So I will talk a little bit more about this later on, but that was one unique feature. A second unique feature of this study is shown in this slide, and that is that this is the first Australian study that we've been able to find that analyses the entire portfolio of projects planned or built since 2001. So the studies that have been done, while credible, look at very small samples, and the difficulty with that is that there's quite a lot of different results for different projects, as I showed in the first slide. And so if you have a small sample, you run the risk of missing out on a sense of the unusual projects and how they play out. So it's been very valuable to look at the whole portfolio. The study does take a conservative approach, so there are quite significant problems in doing this kind of analysis because governments don't publish any useful aggregated data on projects. So what we found is that for a lot of projects, data on their early costs is missing. We relied on publicly available data sources like press releases, company websites, government budget papers and the like. And so we took a conservative approach. So wherever data was missing, we assumed there was no cost overrun. We did then do a more in-depth study of a smaller sample than the whole number of projects, and we found, so rather than the whole 836, we looked at a much smaller sample to check the accuracy of this assumption, and what we found is that probably where there's missing data, the projects are more like the average. So in fact, probably all of the results that that we report in this study are understated because of this conservative approach. Now I'm going to say one more thing about, a couple more things in fact, about some of the questions that you might be wondering about. So one issue is some people have suggested that surely it's better for the costs to go up early on when the project is still getting refined. And I think that's a very reasonable point of view, and it would be absolutely okay for project costs to go up early if there was a robust process for cancelling projects that turned out not to be worth doing once a proper appraisal had been done. But in fact, this is not what happens. Over the past 15 years, 2/3, 65% of all announced projects have been completed. And even when they're announced before a formal funding commitment, these early announcements you can see in the first bar on this graph, 28% of them go on to be completed. So if a politician announces a project with a cost and it turns out on further inspection not to be worth doing, that project is still very likely to be built. So that is the reason, that is the key reason why these early announcements are so problematic. Another issue that people often think is behind this is scope change, and it's a related question whether what's really going on here is that the scope of projects is changing. So we looked at scope and we defined scope to mean extra length on a road or an extra station on a railway, that kind of thing, additions to functionality, in other words, rather than additions to quality. And of course a scope change is only a problem if it's not appraised on its merits as to whether it's worth doing and it's the best way to solve a particular problem and it's the best way to spend public money. With an in-depth study of a subset of the sample, 51 projects, we found that actually scope change is not, it's not that it never happens and it's not that it explains none of the difference, but we found that it's actually only explaining around 11% of the cost overruns. So that was an interesting finding and I think quite surprising for us. So why does all this matter? The reason I think this is important is several reasons actually. One is for a project to be promised for a very unrealistically low cost is quite misleading to the public. It is public money. Promising to build infrastructure for less than it really costs systematically represents infrastructure projects as more attractive and better value for money than they really are. So it may be that it's better value to spend the money on different projects, and it may also be that it's better value to spend the money on something else entirely, like schools or hospitals or pensions. So I guess at this point perhaps I should pause and see if there are any questions that anyone would like to ask.
Thanks, Marion. We've got a very attentive audience, but they're still thinking about their questions, and I think Andrew has one for you at the moment.
Yes, Marion, I'm wondering for our audience whether you might like to define infrastructure project and whether, for example, ticketing infrastructure is included or excluded from this study.
Oh yeah, great question. So we did not include ticketing infrastructure. We included what you might call hard infrastructure. So we haven't included ticketing or signalling systems, but we have it's primarily, in fact, road and rail projects is the great bulk of what's included in here, and it is just transport infrastructure that we looked at.
So you've mentioned that you accessed publicly available data. Was there any data that you would have liked that you weren't able to get for this study?
Oh, absolutely. So yeah, so it's very difficult for people to be able to sort of analyse this kind of project, these kind of projects as I've done, and the way that I did it was using the Deloitte Investment Monitor, which is a quarterly snapshot of projects that are either planned or under construction, and we created a longitudinal data set out of that to look at the project life course. And we also manually built a smaller data set so that we could check the quality of the Deloitte Investment Monitor. But I guess in relying on public reports, we are very much subject to all the vagaries of things not being reported or being reported inaccurately and all those kind of things. And in fact, a lot of data is held within government, and it is held in a way it's partly that it's not useful to people like me or the media or the interested public, but it's also, I think, another reason why this is very important is that it's not available to people doing cost estimation. And quite a big part of this report was looking at what we have found in terms of cost estimation, the guidance that is provided to cost estimators is quite strongly reliant on using distributions of cost outcomes from the past for things like reference class forecasting in particular, but some of the other techniques that are used in cost estimation, but that information is actually not aggregated. And so to do a cost estimate, cost estimators have got good access to information about the cost of inputs like concrete and steel and the workforce and that kind of thing. But there's another component of project cost, which is risk, and some risks are known and predictable, but there's also every project is different, and there are unknown risks that are inherently very difficult to prepare for, and the main ways that you prepare for them are looking at what happened historically. So it would be extremely valuable to have some much better quality information for the whole of Australia on completed projects that would help people to prepare for the more unusual kinds of risks that nevertheless are a feature of infrastructure construction.
Great, thank you,
Thanks for that answer, Marion. I'll just say that they're interesting comments in an era of open data and governments making a lot of moves towards openness in access so that people can build on that. So your comments that there are things that you would have liked to have accessed are quite interesting in that light. I'll just check with Catherine if there's any questions.
From our audience that Catherine's going to read.
Thanks, Rosemary. Yes, we've just got a question from the audience. They were wondering, did you differentiate between public-private partnerships, or did you concentrate purely on government-funded projects?
Thank you for that question. So it's a very interesting question, and I think it's a very important question, and a lot of people have raised this. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to differentiate in the data that I had, because that information is not widely available as to the contract type. So getting access to contracts, I'm afraid, was a bridge too far. I did in the report have a look at Australian studies of this question, and there have been not a huge number of studies, but there have been a few generally fairly small studies. And what I found by looking at these secondary sources is that the jury is still out on this. And so I would love to do a study of that, and it would be fantastic if that information was publicly available so that we could understand in what circumstances different contract types are most effective at managing cost risk in projects.
Okay, thanks, Marion. We just have one more question that's come through. Were you able to compare regional to metro cost project overruns?
It's an interesting question. I'm afraid I wasn't able to do that. It's a question for another day, I think. So I'm not sure what the person asking the question has in mind, but there's quite a lot of these project cost risks that are to do with the external environment, and then there's some that are particular to the project, which were more what I was focusing, and then there are ones like that which are a bit of both. And so I think I will explore that issue in more detail in a future report, I think.
Awesome. If Fiona wants to, we could send her a bit more information at another time. So thanks, Marion. Perhaps we'll move on.
Yeah, so since, so I've got a couple more things that might be interesting, which are a bit more specific. So one finding relates to mode. So I was interested in whether there was a difference between road and rail projects, which form the great majority of the projects that I looked at. And I was thinking about this in terms of when, how do you factor in cost risk in your cost estimates? And this is really about the timing of risk. And what it shows is that road projects are more prone to overrun early than rail. And my understanding, and some of the audience may know more about why this is than I do, but my understanding is that this is probably because rail projects are easier to estimate. They have more standardised components. So in the planning stage, they're more predictable. But both road and rail under construction deal with a lot of interfaces with existing infrastructure, and they have, often they're kind of working around operational infrastructure. So both of them have similar level of complexity when they're actually under construction. So the relevance of this is that project guidance, the manuals that guide cost estimators don't actually advise project proponents to account for mode-specific differences in projects' cost risks. But in fact, there is this pattern, a very clear pattern, that there are mode-specific differences. I'll move on to a more general version of the same point, really, and this is a little bit more technical, I'll just warn you, but I wanted to look at what is happening in the process of cost estimation. So there's, as I said before, there's an element of chance to any particular project finishing on budget. No one knows for sure in advance how any individual project is going to turn out. But historical performance of Australian projects in aggregate shows that cost estimates are, on average, wrong. This slide the first three bars on this slide are looking at budgeted costs. We assume budgeted costs are P75 to P90. In other words, no more than 10 to 25% of projects should exceed their budgets on those sort of cost estimates. But you can also see in the first three bars of assumed prevalence, so this is a prevalence of cost overruns, that the assumption is that overruns and underruns are equally likely. When we looked at actual data, we compared it with a full suite of projects over the past 15 years valued at $20 million or more. The second three bars show you what actually happens, and what's really striking here is that overruns are far more likely than underruns. It's also noticeable that actually more than half of projects come in on budget. So the takeaway from this graph is that there's a very substantial gap between what is estimated and what actually happens. And it's a predictable gap. So this is my point about publishing data. The report recommends that governments create the data to do this kind of assessment themselves, so that we don't any longer assume, the guidance should not be assuming that overruns and underruns are equally likely, because they are clearly not. In fact, in the report, I look at these sort of issues and then look at current projects in the pipeline today. Some of the really big projects like Inland Rail between Brisbane and Melbourne, and WestConnex and Melbourne Metro and the Western Distributor. Interestingly, their worst case cost estimate, or P90 cost estimate, is not that much higher than what people think they're probably going to cost, their P50 estimate. So they're typically around 6 or 7%. The P90 is about 6 or 7% higher than the P50, but in fact, if you look at this historical record, the difference in reality is more like 26%. And what that suggests either is that the P50 is too high, or the P90 is too low. And unfortunately, from the rest of this analysis, it seems to me that it's more likely that the P90 is too low. And what that means is we would expect that quite a few of these projects are going to go over their budget, and when they do, it could be by quite a lot. I'll move to, we're running low on time, so perhaps I'll see if there are any other questions before I go on.
We've still got a very engaged audience and they're doing lots of thinking, so let's perhaps move on and give them time. And if I can just remind them, we've had a few people typing in questions, which has been great. Just to remind you that it's on the toolbar on your screen called questions, and when you type them in, we can read them out. So love to hear from you. Thanks, Marion. Let's move on.
So I've just got two more slides. One is about the guidance that is provided to people for to do cost estimation. So we looked at all the guidance around Australia. There's 51 pieces of official guidance on how to do this for all jurisdictions. And what we found really surprising is essentially that the guidance is all describing the same basic toolkit, and the key elements of the cost estimation toolkit are on this graph: expected value, probability pricing, sensitivity analysis, and reference class forecasting. What's really striking in the guidance is that these basic components of a cost estimator's toolkit are not consistently recommended. And I don't mean just in an individual piece of guidance, but I mean for a jurisdiction. So they're inconsistently recommended. We also found that often there is not very much guidance that takes the user through the relationships between these different tools, and things like how to use these things like probability pricing and reference class forecasting that rely upon a distribution of previous cost outcomes are essentially impossible for someone to actually give effect to properly because that data is not available. My final slide is about contingency. This is really about managing cost risk rather than minimising it or avoiding it. Once you're in the business of running a project, it's got the risks it's got. What is the most cost-efficient way to manage those risks? And we looked at contingencies for projects and found that in many jurisdictions, this does vary quite a bit across different states, but we found in various jurisdictions it's very common for the contingency to be held against the individual project, and therefore if it wasn't needed for the project, for it to be spent on things like quality upgrades, scope extensions or other purposes for the agency holding it. The problem with this is most projects should not come in over budget, and so the contingency should be saved up for the one that does. And this slide is really a stylised slide showing showing the difference in how much of the contingency you need to hold if you hold it in a central pool where the one contingency can be used for various projects and only be called upon some of the time, or if you hold it against an individual project. So I'll move on now to, so that's the end of my my slides, but and I see that we're close to the end of our time, but I'm happy to take any further questions if there are any.
Thanks, Marion. Great, nice planning, haven't we? We've come to our half-hour time slot. We've now got a whole lot of questions, awesome questions, so I'm going to ask Catherine to pick out of quite a few. Thank you to Anthony, Leith, Drew and Sebastian. Catherine, could you pick two? And just to let people know that time is up, so if you have to go to a meeting or head off somewhere, please do. We will share the recording with you. So we'll just go on. Have you got time, Marion, for another 5 minutes?
Sure, yes.
Awesome. All right. Over to you, Catherine, to ask one or two questions.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we have quite a few questions coming in. The first one is, you mentioned international studies that informed your research. I would be interested to hear if these trends are as consistently observed in overseas jurisdictions.
Yeah, so there's quite a big international literature on this, and as I mentioned at the start, I got interested in it because of the work of Flyberg, And one of his absolute headline findings was that rail projects are more prone to overrun than road projects. So that was one of the things that we looked at quite early on. And in fact, in Australia, we don't follow that trend. It's road projects that are more prone. And I would speculate that the politicised nature of road projects is sort of more acute than for rail. But it's a bit hard to say. I think in terms of where we sit internationally, I think people often think, I've had people say to me, oh, we're very good by international standards. I didn't really find that to be the case. It looks like Australia is around the middle of the pack internationally, or perhaps a little lower. But there are it's always a bit fraught to make international comparisons because institutions are very different. And I would also say that the Flyberg studies and a lot of studies have spun off them have, I think they've gone from first contract costs, so they haven't gone as far back to the initial announcement as we were able to go with this study.
Great, thank you, Marion. I think we have time for one final question. It's been widely commented on in recent years that infrastructure construction costs have been increasing significantly. Do you agree that this is happening? And if so, what do you see as being the major causes?
It has been commented a lot. I've been quite interested in that as well. I didn't study that in this particular project. I think people have, one thing that I can comment on that I did look at was the impact of where we are in the economic cycle. So in some of the regression analysis we looked at the pre and post global financial crisis periods to see if that made a difference. And it did actually make a bit of a difference. We'll just see if I can find the figure. So after the global financial crisis, the construction period has been more tightly, less prone to overruns, and I would speculate that that it's more tightly managed. But we're just as prone to cost overruns in the early period when the projects are first announced, which is really the stage that politicians are responsible for. So that part of it is quite costly. I think the discipline around project management seems to have increased. I've had a comment from a colleague in Western Australia that, and I've found it here in Victoria too, that people have said, well, when there isn't much work, you get very competitive cost estimates, whereas at a time when all the construction is for the mining and resources sector in WA, then it will be more costly to try to find companies willing to do it, and you may have to pay a premium. So all of that, I think, makes perfect sense. And we did find, we're unable to really prove that out of this kind of analysis. I think it is a very important question, and people make a lot of assertions about it, but I haven't seen much in the way of hard evidence to really support or refute that perspective. So again, I think it's a very fruitful area for future work.
Interesting, and some very interesting questions. Thank you to our audience. Anyone who didn't get their questions answered will be in contact by email. And so before I ask you, Marion, for your final key message, I thought I'd see if Andrew has a key message.
Yes, I would like to thank Marion for her time today. It's certainly a huge piece of work in terms of the commitment to go through all that data, and especially to do the case studies in more detail. And I think you've certainly provided some data to assist the assumptions and the debates that occur around cost overruns and aid things going forward. I would, if I can slightly add to the questions, there's a few questions that we do ask our NIS webinar presenters in general because they're in the transport sector, and I wondered if you could provide some really brief answers to these. Do you have a most important current issue for the transport sector? It might be cost overruns, or you might be over those, and you might have another one.
Yeah, I guess I have actually started work on my next project, which is on value capture, and I think that's a very interesting issue. Perhaps some of the audience are involved in this as well. So it seems to have become a very fashionable idea, and so I'm having a look at that to see kind of what the scope for it is, when's a good time to use it, when's not a good time to use it. So that's one issue that I think is very interesting. I think in 2017 I also plan to do a more detailed report on road pricing, which has a similar character, so we're seeing a lot of it, and I think that it's an issue that's been around for insiders to the transport world for a long time, but seems to me to be sort of hitting the mainstream consciousness to a greater extent, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out and whether in fact there is a way that that governments and can make this look palatable to the community.
And is there something the transport sector is presently doing well, in your eyes?
So I guess the sector is huge and varied, and it's an enabling sector to all other sectors of the economy. So its scope and scale is just absolutely huge, and basically the system does work very well. I think it's true that I'm focusing on areas where it could work better, but it's not to say that it isn't fundamentally a very high-functioning system.
Okay, that's a very positive note to end on. Again, thank you for your time and for going in depth with the study that was released this week. We thank the Grattan team for their for doing the work and sharing it with us today. I also thank everybody who spent their time listening, and especially to those who asked questions. And again, we will endeavour to get responses to questions that were not able to be part of the presentation today. So thank you very much, Marion, on behalf of ARB and the National Interest Services Program. And thank you to everyone who has attended today.
Any further thoughts from you, Marion?
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today, and thank you for everybody who dialed in.
Thank you, and thanks to Catherine for fielding the questions. We'd like to thank our audience for being so interactive today, and I'm sure that they've appreciated the very straight, plain, uncomplicated graphs that you've prepared to share the research outcomes. And if they could stay on the line and fill out the survey, that helps us to make even more awesome webinars in the future. Thank you.